Welcome, explorers of the world's great mysteries. I'm Doug Kenyon, editor and publisher of Atlantis Rising magazine. We call this program simply Conversations, and we feature the many great contributors to our publication, world-class researchers who dare to follow real evidence where it leads and to challenge the conventional wisdom, whatever it may be. In just a moment, I'll be talking to popular alternative science researcher and internet columnist Ben Stoecker. But first, let me introduce those of you unfamiliar with Atlantis Rising magazine to our unique publication. Focusing on ancient mysteries, unexplained anomalies, and future science, Atlantis Rising magazine has for many years provided a serious forum for alternative ideas of prehistory, science, and culture, which, when not entirely ignored by the mainstream press, are yet seldom treated with the respect they deserve. Our magazine appears bi-monthly, and you can find it on stands in most major chain bookstores such as Barnes & Noble, Hastings, Books A Million, etc. It's also available in many independent stores. If your favorite magazine dealer doesn't carry it, ask why. For iPad users, our free app can be found in the Apple App Store. Postal subscriptions are also available worldwide, and you can get it in PDF form on an issue-by-issue basis directly from our website, atlantisrising.com. Among the many great articles in our March-April 2014 issue is a provocative story by maverick scientist Susan Martinez. It's called Global Drying. Maybe it's not warming that should most alarm us. In The Man Who Could Not Be King, Stephen Sora chronicles the many secrets of Francis Bacon. And in Pythagoras and the Beanstalks, John Chambers explores what could have inspired a curious ancient proscription against eating beans, a belief which led to tragic results. And you'll also find a very exciting piece by geologist Dr. Robert Schoch. In Journey to Gunung Padang, Dr. Schoch explores amazing new evidence for lost Ice Age civilization in Indonesia. And there's a very interesting piece by our current guest, William B. Stoecker. In The Beasts of Beringia, Stoecker questions just how Earth's many species got to where we find them today. Science, it is clear, has some serious explaining to do. William B. Stoecker, known to his friends as Ben, is a maverick researcher, albeit a lifelong one, into many of the most baffling mysteries of science and lost history. A former Air Force intelligence officer, he's mastered the techniques of getting past the standard public pronouncements of the establishment and to uncovering the frequently contrary facts hidden between the lines and often concealed evidence. Many of his shocking discoveries have been reported in his book, The Atlantis Conspiracy, which you can buy on the internet. His regular articles on the popular Unexplained Mysteries site are followed by a growing, enthusiastic, and loyal audience, and readers of Atlantis Rising magazine have learned that though his conclusions can be startling and controversial, Ben Stoecker knows his stuff. Welcome to Atlantis Rising Conversations, Ben.
Oh, thank you.
In your article, The Beasts of Beringia, in the March-April 2014 issue, you explain that, quoting now, we're assured by geologists that in the remote past, all of the continents more than once were even more obviously and tightly connected to form supercontinents like Pangea. The continents have drifted about, joining and then separating over and over in various combinations, and this seems to explain why many of the same fossils are found on more than one continent. The current paradigm to explain all of this is plate tectonics, which tells us that Earth's crust is divided into a number of sections or plates, which move apart at seafloor spreading zones, slide under one another at subduction zones, or scrape against one another at such locations as the west coast of North America. This theory, supported by overwhelming evidence, is almost certainly correct, although the exact mechanism for producing new seafloor crust is imperfectly understood. End of quote. And yet you say all of this, quote, poses some very serious problems, largely ignored or swept under the rug by conventionally minded scientists, end quote. Can you explain to us in layman's terms just why you think this is so?
Well, part of the problem deals with plate tectonics itself, which is, I believe, the evidence is pretty strong. It's a valid theory. It's correct, basically. But as even the geologists and geophysicists themselves, in that we don't understand the mechanism of it perfectly. And they used to think that, that the plates were moved from the seafloor spreading zones, like the mid-Atlantic ridge, where magma would come up. But magma doesn't come up in long sheets or great arcs over the Earth's curved surface. It comes up in hot spots like, lava plumes, magma plumes from the mantle, hot spots like Yellowstone or Iceland. And Iceland is on the mid-Atlantic ridge. So it appears that there are other factors at work, and that the seafloor plates may be pulled from their margins as much as pushed from the spreading zones. That the new rock cools off. As it cools, it becomes more dense and heavier. It slides down the slope of the mid-Atlantic ridge, for example, and then it's weighted down by sediment and absorbs water, and finally weighted down as subducts under continental margins.
Now, your problem though, has to deal with the migrations from different areas, right?
Yeah, that's the main topic. The main and most important topic is, how did the animals, and I didn't even address the question of plants, that would be a similar problem, how did all the animals get where they are today? We know that in the past, the continents have been completely joined together at various times, and obviously animals could migrate here and there. But at other times they've been separated. In explaining the presence of similar species or the same species in different continents becomes more difficult. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the region called Beringia. Now, according to theory, the Americas separated from Eurasia and Africa and gradually drifted west across the new Atlantic Ocean, which was just being born in that process. Finally, North America began to approach Siberia, northeastern Asia, and push closer and closer to it and push up the seafloor there where they joined together. So really, under the water, it's all continental shelf. It's all continent. Asia, Eurasia, and North America are actually joined together. It's just that there's very shallow ocean over that section of continental shelf in the Bering Straits. And this has probably only existed, this region, this continental shelf here, in the last few million years or tens of millions of years at the most. There are no exact figures available.
So how long? How long have the continents been completely separated from each other?
Well, they've never been completely separated.
What I mean is with separated by oceans.
The Americas. It was actually before the dinosaurs. It was quite a long time ago. But I didn't. That wasn't part of my article, so I didn't research that particular detail. It didn't matter to the main thesis. It's been a long time though. But today, Doug, if you look, the continents are partly joined already. Of course, Europe and Asia are one continent. Europe being a peninsula on the west side, is just Eurasia, and it's joined with Africa, almost joined at Gibraltar, and completely joined in the Sinai to Africa. North and South America are connected by the Central American Isthmus, a line of volcanoes, and of course now North America is really one continent with Asia.
But just to help kind of clarify it from my standpoint, help to understand, what you're saying is that the continents, most of the animals evolved or developed after the continents were separated, and yet we find the same animals on different continents,
right?
Without any way to explain how they got from one place to the other.
They had to migrate somehow, and the theory that the biologists and zoologists used and the evolutionary biologists used to explain the presence of many of the same animals, particularly around the northern hemisphere, is that animals migrated back and forth across the Bering Straits, Beringia. But there is no evidence that Beringia, during interglacial periods when the world is warm, has ever been dry land. We're not certain of that. It could have been, but the geologists have never found any evidence it was ever any higher than it is today. Now, during the peak of the last major glaciation. Technically, we're always in an ice age for the last couple of million years, and then you have glaciations. But we all use the familiar term ice age to refer to those glaciations. So I'll use the common terminology.
Mm-hmm.
And the last ice age, at the peak of it, so much ice was locked up in the huge continental ice sheets, like in North America, for example, that at the peak, the sea levels around the world were perhaps some 400 feet lower than today. And most of the seafloor in the Bering Straits areas, it's only like 50 to 100 feet deep for vast areas. That sounds deep. Not to me so much, I'm a scuba diver, but to most people it sounds deep. But the deep oceans have an average depth approaching 3 miles. So this is continental shelf. So during the last major ice age, this was land, and any animals who could withstand the horrendous, horrible climate up there, it's bad now and worse during the ice age, could have migrated back and forth. So up to a point, it seems like a good theory. But then it begins to break down. Now, for example, we're pretty sure that horses and camels evolved in the Americas. So I don't believe in evolution, by the way. I've gradually become convinced by the weight of the evidence that intelligent design is the correct model.
We'll talk about that a little bit more later. I just want to make sure people understand exactly what you're saying here about how the problem with understanding how the animals got to where they are.
Well, supposedly camels and horses developed in the Americas, evolved or were created by intelligent design, however, and migrated across the Bering Straits into Eurasia. And supposedly lions developed in Africa and then spread across Eurasia into the Americas, and so forth. And elephants also spread across. All these various animals migrated. But the problem is that a lot of the animals were in both places before any of the ice ages, before the Pleistocene epoch even began, and presumably during that period, the Bering Straits would have been water. And you don't very often see animals swimming across 50 miles of open seawater. So the question is, how did some of them get where they are during that period, before the ice ages even began?
Give us some examples of some of the anomalies you're talking about here.
Well, I'm going to have to look back at my own article here.
Well, I remember, for example, you were talking about lions and initially some of the bears and various monkeys.
Well, lions are a minor problem. They could have migrated up into cold climates. Lions don't just live in the tropics. They live, for example, in northern India today, which is above the tropics, and we know that they were in America in prehistoric times, even shortly after the last ice age. And in Europe, they had lions like in Italy as recently as 3,000 years ago. And as recently as a few hundred years ago, they had them in the Near East and Iran and places like that. So conceivably, they might have migrated. But the question is, tigers are really, really cold climate animals. They like cold weather even more than lions. And tigers, we know, live all over Asia. They're much more widespread than lions are in Asia. So the question is, why is it that we got lions, but we didn't get tigers? It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. We know that tigers live in Siberia today, but there's no lions in Siberia today, and they're not known to have been any in the past. And yet lions are here and tigers aren't. And a bigger problem would be the monkeys. You have the Old World and New World monkeys, which are quite different in many ways. And the Americas, the tropical regions, were separated long before monkeys evolved. We believe that there were some very, very primitive primates that had evolved, or as I believe, more likely intelligent design, had developed. But by the time that the Americas were separated from Africa, for example, there still were no monkeys at that time. And yet now we have monkeys in South America. They are different from the Old World monkeys, but they're related to them. And the question is, how did they get there? And the evolutionary biologists were used to coming up with fanciful theories like a land bridge. Well, land bridges, Beringia could be a land bridge, and the Isthmus of Panama, but that's about the only ones we know of. There was no evidence of any kind of land bridge across the Atlantic Ocean ever. No geological evidence. It would have left some evidence. Or they talk about islands as stepping stones. Well, you don't step from one island to another, for crying out loud. I've been on Isla Cozumel in Mexico. There's no monkeys there. I've been on the Yucatan mainland, and there are. And that's like, less than 20 miles of ocean, and yet they haven't crossed it.
So
How would they
essentially,
cross the Atlantic? It just doesn't add up.
so so you have these tropical, essentially, animals requiring, and the only way they can get from one continent to another is by passing through, essentially, an Arctic zone.
Right. They would have to come across Beringia since there was no land bridge or stepping stones across the Atlantic. And yet, the coldest weather monkeys we see today are Japanese macaques, and they exist in a temperate zone area, Japan, that has cold, snowy winters. But there's never been any monkeys found up in Siberia, up in that region, ever. Nor are there any fossil monkeys in Alaska or the northern parts of North America, Canada, and the northern U.S. And there are no monkeys now presently living, even temperate zone macaque-type monkeys living in Canada or the U.S. or Alaska. And we just find them mostly in the tropics in the Old World and almost entirely in the tropics in the New World. In fact, entirely. You don't find any monkeys north of the tropics of Mexico. So how did they get here? It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. There's simply no explanation for it.
Well, let me ask you what about, say, something like a pole shift, if that happened? If, for example, if an area which was presently in a frozen region was at some time in the past might have been in a temperate zone. For example, don't they find tropical fossils in Antarctica?
Well, the problem there is they still have to get across the Bering Straits, and if it was warm, the ocean and sea levels would be at least as high today and probably higher. Mm-hmm. I mean, for the Bering Straits to have a warm climate, the world would have to be warm, at least that region would, and it would be water. I suppose if you really push the boundaries, maybe there conceivably could have been a time when Beringia was in a warm area, but the Earth overall was cold. They were having an ice age, and mm-hmm. sea levels were low, but Beringia was in a warm climate. But there's no evidence that's happened at any time since we've had ice ages. I mean, you have ice ages beginning the Pleistocene, and then you had some ice ages way back before the time of the dinosaurs, way back. But in between, all that period in between, no ice ages. So sea levels have been pretty high. There's no evidence sea levels are ever lowered. So the Bering Straits have been impassable. Plus, which I have extreme doubts about the whole pole shift theory. Magnetic poles, yes, but the geological pole, I would argue strongly against that. The probability of it.
I'm not at all persuaded on that myself, but I thought that might offer a potential hypothesis for how some migrations might have occurred. But I guess we still have basically, generally speaking, the problem you're talking about.
Yeah.
How does this all fit into the Darwinian theory of survival of the fittest and so forth? Do you see any?
I long ago became convinced that Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, I have to call it neo-Darwinism because they brought in genetics, which there was no science of genetics in Darwin's time, and they brought in mutations, which he never heard of. So we call it neo-Darwinism now. You get random mutations and natural selection governing the process of evolution. But I have long been convinced that theory is false. It's just wrong. I'm not saying there's no such thing as evolution. Certainly there has been evolution or something resembling evolution, and I don't doubt that natural selection has played some role in it. But clearly, overwhelmingly, the evidence is that there's something more going on. And so, to me, this whole problem of these animals being in unexpected places is yet one more nail, albeit not a major one, but it's one more nail in the coffin for Darwinism. Because how did they get here? If you believe in intelligent design, I suppose, and this is a bit of a stretch itself, the question then is, does the designer, and I'm sorry to tell people this, but if you're going to have intelligent design, almost by definition, the only conceivable being who would have the longevity, the patience, the power, and a motive beyond our comprehension to be meddling in the process of life for 3 or 4 billion years would be a supreme being, a God. I don't belong to any established religion. I'm not going to preach one. I'm just saying that the evidence is that there is some sort of supreme being. But so the problem then is that if you have intelligent design, does the Supreme Being modify an existing species to create a new species, and the old species give birth to a new one, in which case you have to worry about, for example, how would a dinosaur teach a baby bird to fly? Assuming a dinosaur gave birth to a bird, or does it work differently? Does a Supreme Being or designer, people are happier with that, does the designer simply create a new species based on existing species? Clearly, the species are connected. Clearly, there's a web of life, and at first glance, you look at the fossil record and life today, it does look like Darwinism is correct at first glance. It's just when you start looking at the details.
Well, speaking of those details, what do you think? Could you get into the subject a little bit of irreducible complexity and how that applies to the subject here of intelligent design?
Yeah, just to give you one of many, many, many examples. I could talk at some length about cell biology. I'm not an expert on the topic, but I mentioned birds. Okay, and I've talked about this a number of times in other articles and other sites. You have flight being invented over and over. You have insects flying. Okay, one day there were crawling insects. Next day there were flying insects. One day there were reptiles, and the next day there were pterosaurs flying. One day there were small dinosaurs or something related to dinosaurs, and the next day there were birds flying. One day there was some kind of animal, we don't even know what, and the next day there were bats flying, bats with wings and sonar, and just right out of nowhere. And to fly, first of all, you need the wings, okay, and then you need the flight muscles, extremely powerful flight muscles, a lot of endurance. Then you have to have the cardiovascular system and the lungs to support that flight. And then you have to have perfect eyesight, binocular vision helps too. And then on top of all that, you've got to have a pilot. You've got to have an airplane, so to speak, with the wings and the engine. Then you've got to have a pilot. In other words, you've got to have flight behavior. You have to have an animal that knows how to fly. And you look, you think, well, maybe there were gliding species in between, that was more gradual. And we have gliding animals today, gliding lizards, flying squirrels, sugar gliders, which are gliding marsupials, even flying snakes. But you look back to the insects, there were no gliding insects, no remains have ever been found of any gliding insects that are intermediate between the crawling insects and the flying. And nothing before the flying reptiles, if they indeed were reptiles, the pterosaurs, or the birds, or the bats. It just bang, there it is, in all the full complexity. So you have the gaps in the fossil record and the irreducible complexity both at the same time. And we see these kind of problems over and over.
So there isn't, the basic idea is there isn't the system that you imagine, in this case you're talking about flight, requires many developments.
Yeah, they all have to
none
be
of
there
which
at
you
once.
can do without.
Yeah, if you have an animal that knows how to fly, and that's what his whole mind is developed and is focused on flying, and it doesn't have wings, that animal's going to die. If you have an animal that has wings, big wings, that doesn't know how to fly, those wings are just a liability, make it more fragile, hard to move around, it's going to die. And the Darwinists are hoisting on their own petard because the animal would not be fit to survive. Survival of the fittest would wipe it out. It's all got to be there. And the same thing is true with a good deal of the cell, individual cells. Darwin knew next to nothing about the cells. He didn't know about DNA and RNA. He didn't know about mitochondria and mitochondrial DNA. He didn't know there was a nucleus, nucleolus, and all the eukaryotes. Those are cells that have their DNA concentrated in the nucleus. Any of this. He didn't know about any of it. And the cells, everything has to work. Every component has to be there. If just one of them is not there, the organism cannot survive. So this just goes on and on. I could go on and on at great length about this. And I'm sure someone who's an expert on the topic could go on a lot further. But the evidence is overwhelming that there has been some kind of intelligent design. That doesn't mean there wasn't evolution, but it wasn't evolution in the Darwinist, the narrow materialistic atheist Darwinist sense. So then the question is, could the Supreme Being, the designer, have created species based on existing species and just put them somewhere? Could he have taken an old world monkey and based on that old world monkey design created a new world monkey? Or for all we know, vice versa. Because North and South, or the Americas separated from Africa, by the way, before monkeys even existed. And that was long before Beringia. There was a period there when there were monkeys in the New World, but the New World still hadn't shifted close enough to Asia to form the Beringian Straits at all. So you have to be open to the possibility that the Supreme Being, the designer, just suddenly creates new species and places them wherever he feels like it. Again, for reasons utterly beyond our comprehension.
So you're talking about you see as plausible the regular introduction of new species without a long evolutionary prologue of some kind.
Well, certainly the fossil record, with all the gaps in the fossil record, seems to hint that. I know
do you think new species are appearing now?
Well, there may be some new species, in the deep ocean and insects and so forth. They're always discovering new species, and there's never any way to be certain, have these species been here all along and now they're just being discovered? I'm sure that's true in most cases. Or are a few of them, newly created? And for a number of years now, I've considered the possibility, I'm not saying it's going to happen, I can't foretell the future, that we might suddenly see all sorts of new species appear just right out of nowhere. One of the things that I find strange is you see these animals that look a little bit like coyotes in Texas and other areas have been suddenly appearing in the last few years, but not only don't have any hair, but they have a longer snout and protruding teeth. They look a little different from any dogs or coyotes, and you got to wonder, are they a new species made by slightly modifying existing ones or not? Are new species appearing, or will they perhaps appear quite suddenly? We just don't know for sure.
Do you think maybe something like Yeti or Bigfoot would be an example of this kind of thing?
It's entirely possible. But the Yeti or Bigfoot, the mystery there, if you look at Bigfoot sightings on a map, if they were hoaxes, you'd expect most of them to be where the people are, because people cause hoaxes, so you'd get most of your hoaxes in and around major urban centers. On the other hand, if they were a species living in the wilderness without our knowing about it, most of them would be in remote wilderness areas, and indeed some of them are. But an awful lot of the Bigfoot sightings are in areas that are in between. They're spread all over. There's no pattern to it. And they're living in areas where there are not extensive forest or wilderness areas. And I don't doubt that such animals could hide underground and be nocturnal and be very clever and avoid ever being caught or being roadkill. But it's kind of hard to figure out how you could have a breeding community of them. In other words, you've got to have enough animals in a given species, enough animals and genetic diversity to have a breeding community that won't get inbred and wiped out. And mates have got to be able to find mates and so on.
So this would have to be for a long time.
Yeah, for a long time. So that makes it look like maybe the Bigfoot either is something that lives way underground somewhere, and that's kind of strange, or it's interdimensional or actually paranormal in many cases. That doesn't rule out the possibility that some of them are physical animals. And maybe they're just appearing or being introduced every so often. I don't know. This is just one of the greatest mysteries, and there's just one mystery behind another, and it's like shells. You solve one mystery, and there's another behind. Well, I guess that's what makes life interesting.
But, the establishment, and I mean the academic establishment, seems, even while they talk about complexity and so forth, they seem to be committed to the idea that the process of producing all that we see in life can be boiled down to simple processes that are moving at a standard rate in terms of by that I mean gradualism, the idea that things got to where they are, everything that the way the forces of nature are operating today is the way they have always operated. And therefore, if you want to figure out how long something's been around, you have to extrapolate back from that.
Well, if you want to get a job in academia in the fields of biology or zoology or genetics, evolutionary biology, you've got to toe the party line. You probably won't even get a degree if you buck the program and don't agree with the majority of the people in charge. And you certainly, even if you get a degree, you're not likely to get a teaching job or a government research job.
Why do you think?
So,
What do you think is the basis of that kind of systematic uh, process that we see so well established? Where does it come from? What is it in the human character that causes this kind of situation to develop?
well, you look back at the birth of modern science, and what's interesting, like the Royal Academy, for example, is you might say is really where modern Western science, atheist, materialist, reductionist science began. And yet the Royal Academy was largely composed of people who belonged to the Masons and the Rosicrucians, who are actually mystics.
Like Isaac Newton.
And even today, not all scientists by any means are knee-jerk materialists or atheists. A lot of them are very open-minded and very rational. In the past, this was even more so. But at some point, gradually, the materialists, either by accident or by design, and I know you don't want to get into conspiracy, I'm heavily into conspiracy, either by accident or design, science has largely got taken over by the reductionists, by the atheist materialists, who believe that the prime reality is matter. Now, in my book, The Atlantis Conspiracy, in the very first chapter, I made what I think to this day was a pretty strong argument in favor of philosophical idealism. But apparently the powers that be don't care for that idea.
Well, I think that there are ways you can look at this short of a conspiracy. You could see it as a kind of almost something flowing almost naturally out of the human psychology or the human character, like just the idea of sort of the tribal idea of protecting your own and trying to preserve your own power. And therefore, and in doing so, you develop and you evolve all kinds of systems to make that happen. And that at least is, I think, doesn't necessarily, I mean, I'm not ruling out conspiracy, but I'm thinking you can get to the same result in a fairly natural way.
Yeah. Well, undoubtedly, that's what sustains the system. If the only people who are going to get jobs in academia in particular, and often the only people who will get advanced degrees are people who hew to the atheist materialist line or reductionist, then it's going to be a self-sustaining system. They're going to promote others like them, and so on and so on and so on, and the system just continues like that.
Go ahead.
Well, I personally, my own suspicion is that no science in any field, biology, physics, any field, no science based on what I call knee-jerk materialism is ever going to answer the most important questions. Look at the mess that physics is in today. I mean, I'm just a layman. I'm not a physicist, and I'm by no means qualified to come up with a new theory of physics. But I think any reasonably intelligent layman, looking at what physicists keep telling us, and looking at the model of the week, they keep coming up. They had strings, then they had membranes. It just goes on and on and on, building this big tower that's just top-heavy and about to fall over. Anybody can see that there's some problems, that it's just not working. That we need, in many cases, to kind of go back to the drawing boards, perhaps, and not quite start over, but go back a ways and take a new run at the truth from a slightly different angle. But the establishment people aren't doing that, not in biology or in physics or anywhere. At least most of them aren't.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that certainly where all of this seems to go, in my opinion, is that ultimately you end up talking about good and evil. And I'm not saying that's wrong. Quite the contrary. It's just that is the subject when it gets to that level of intensity. Then it's people end up having to take sides. And I'm not saying that that's not the way it ought to be. Ultimately, perhaps that is the way it's supposed to be. In fact, I don't doubt that it is. But I don't know whether you can get to that area prematurely. I don't know does that make sense? Do you know what I'm saying? I think people are prepared to jump to conclusions about how to explain things before they have all the information, before they really have the big picture, before they really see how it all fits together. They want to pin the tail on the donkey, or they want to to decide or judge, I guess, who is indeed the perpetrator and who isn't. I'm not saying there's not a perpetrator, but it's, before you can come to that point, you better have your case together.
Yeah. Well, I try to avoid jumping to conclusions. I'm sure I do it sometimes, but mostly what I'm seeing, or as I said earlier, is mystery. Just one mystery behind another, things that I don't understand and things I suspect nobody understands. And you never quite get there. We never quite figure things out. We think we're making progress or getting closer. It's a fascinating quest, but it's a journey perhaps that has no end.
Well,
we never quite figure things out. You were talking earlier about that belief that they had, that the same processes are always at work and always have been. As you probably know, in the early days of geology, of course, it was just called natural philosophy back then, and they didn't differentiate the sciences so much. People believed in catastrophism. They believed in the great flood of Noah and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
But gradually, people who believed in uniformitarianism took over the whole field,
right,
especially in geology. You can see, mountains slowly building up. You can see river valleys eroding away. You can see these slow, gradual processes are real. They happen. But in the last 50 or 60 years or so, the catastrophists have come back with a vengeance. The uniformitarians are partly correct. These gradual processes are happening. But we began to learn about monstrous asteroid and cometary impacts, for example. I mean, it was right there in front of us all along. We have smaller craters on Earth. We have the craters all over the moon. And now we're beginning to notice all the really ancient astrobleams on the Earth. And then in addition to these huge impacts, we have megavolcanic eruptions, mega tsunamis. Basically, we're living in a very dangerous universe, on a dangerous world in a dangerous universe. And indeed, some very catastrophic and very sudden and abrupt things do happen. And perhaps they happen not only in the realm of geology and climate, but also in biology. We just don't know for certain, but it looks like things can happen pretty fast sometimes.
Well, Immanuel Velikovsky, who is the catastrophist, probably has had the most influence in the last 50 years, even though he was ostracized by mainstream science, was also, as I'm sure you know, a psychiatrist, and who held to the idea that it was that the many catastrophic experiences in human history had left us with amnesia, and that many of the things, the great wrongs of society, the problems we have are really born out of an amnesia, a psychosis, that causes us therefore to behave in a self-destructive way. And so what do you think of that idea?
Well, it's impossible to prove or disprove, but I think it kind of makes sense. You could have, whether people are reincarnated, I don't know. I think either we're reincarnated or there's an afterlife, or maybe both in different cases. But, I'm almost certain that there's some sort of collective consciousness, and that memories, overall memories, are passed down over vast eons of time. I know that, you take, for example, Crater Lake up in Oregon. Well, that blew up about 6,000 years ago, I think. And yet the Indians still have a legend about its formation, just passed down orally. And in addition to oral tradition being passed down, you get possibly this subconscious memory that's also passed down. And through the group consciousness, through the continuing consciousness of the species. And certainly we have some terrible catastrophes in the past. We have the beginning of the last ice age, just for one, probably set off, at least in part, by the eruption of the volcano Toba, a megavolcano in Indonesia. And then we have the ice age beginning to end, and all of a sudden you have some event causing the Younger Dryas event, when the ice age, even as the Earth was beginning to warm, suddenly returned about 13,000 before the present, 13,000 years ago, with a vengeance. And then it warmed up again and sea levels rose. And they had the Holocene optimum when things were pretty nice, and then the Earth started getting colder and drier about 5,000 years ago, and so on and so on and so on. There's always something happening that's very traumatic and very difficult. And then along with that, you have the megavolcanoes, and you have the asteroids and mega tsunamis, and it's just, yeah.
Well, in the I mentioned in our uh, DVD or this documentary that we produced, which you may have, I don't know if you've seen it or not, The Technologies of the Gods, but the idea that uh, as from the science fiction story, I don't know if you've ever read it, A Canticle for Leibowitz, but
I read that ages ago, and I don't remember very much of it. I was a child at the time. It was back in the 50s.
well, the yeah, it's been around a while, and it impressed me very much at the time. But the idea that you know uh, the world has been destroyed, or civilization as we know it has been destroyed, but that there the memory of what happened has become, is this is that amnesia factor at work. People only vaguely after a period of time have any kind of recollection of what actually happened or how it happened. And so you get all kinds of folklore and myths that misinterpret things that that we understand now, but because you're talking about something preserved by a very naive uh, and ignorant world in the future, it's totally misunderstood. In the book, they have things like an electronic diagram is made into some kind of of a, of a relic, some kind of a holy relic. And the suggestion was that actually many of the things that uh, many of our belief systems are really based upon misunderstood evidence of a past that happened, and yet now we're trying to understand it and trying to wrap our minds around evidence that seems to make no sense. And anyway, it was very, I thought, quite plausible the way it worked in the story.
Well, that got me thinking when you were saying that. It got me thinking again about the Great Pyramid at Giza. You know, you look at a diagram of it, a cutaway showing all the chambers, and at least to me, looking at that bizarre structure, the internal structure, it just jumps out. And I know other people have thought of this before me. Certainly Christopher Dunn,
Right.
to name but one, who's really got into it and done the research. It's a machine. I mean, for crying out loud, it's a machine. You can see it right there. It's a machine, but it's a machine of a technology, not like our technology, but more or less advanced on the same line, but rather a technology on a completely different line that we don't even recognize as technology.
Well,
I think there are all sorts of things right around us that we don't see because they're just so different and so alien to our modern way of thinking. When I went to Mexico ages ago and walked up the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, I was just fascinated by the pyramids. And I've read up about that pyramid there, for example. And it's about half the height, but the same base perimeter as the Great Pyramid at Giza. And well, if the Giza is a machine, could this also be a machine? And then if the one at Teotihuacan is a machine, how could it function if it's only half as high as the one in Egypt? And it turns out it has a layer of mica going through the thing. At least they did originally. It's been, it's been rebuilt quite a bit by the authorities. But it had a layer of mica, and mica has all sorts of interesting qualities. For example, it's dielectric, so it could be that the mica compensates for the lack of height. But I think there's a lot of stuff like that we don't recognize, that we've forgotten about, and we don't see the patterns that are right there, all around us.
Yeah, well, I think amnesia is one of our major challenges here, and I think we're about out of time. Ben, and I appreciate your talking to us, and we'll try to pick this up again down the road some ways.
All right. Well, thank you for sending the interview on.
Okay. Thanks, Ben.
Okay.
Talk to you later. Thank you, Ben. We've been talking with popular alternative science researcher and internet columnist William Ben Stoecker. To get deeper into his interesting research into paleontology, archaeology, lost history, and many other topics, we recommend his many articles in Atlantis Rising. For more on his latest piece, go to our website at atlantisrising.com. This is Doug Kenyon for Atlantis Rising Conversations.